I'm really delighted to be chatting about this today with you. This is not a talk so much as some remarks about some things that I've been experiencing and noting in my years as a critic, working both in Christian media and in the mainstream. So I just want to kind of throw some things at you for thought, and hopefully, prompt some questions. I'm really curious to see what you have to say. I have some slides, so I'm going to share them because I'm a college professor, and so that is how I like to work too. So I called this session Going Beyond Cultural Engagement because cultural engagement is one of those phrases that I hear people say a lot. I teach at a Christian college. I teach at the King's College in New York. People certainly say, cultural engagement or engage culture. I see it on church websites. One of my degrees is from a school that has engaged the culture and changed the world in the logo. So I understand the fondness for this phrase, but I think that we often don't really know what we're talking about when we say this. And so I want to push us beyond thinking about engaging culture and thinking about what it actually means to be Christians interacting with culture, perhaps writing about it, or becoming critics in some way, all kinds of different ways that we interact with culture and of course creating culture. So first, let's think briefly about this phrase, cultural engagement. So I have found that what people normally mean when they say cultural engagement is something like thinking and talking about culture. That we watch a movie, for instance, and I'm probably going to talk about movies a lot because that is my main job, is to write about movies. So we're going to watch a movie, and then we're going to get together and we're going to talk about it, or we're going to write a critique of it, or we're going to come up with all the ways it does or doesn't fit our worldview, or we're going to look at it and see what kinds of things we can learn from it, that we can apply to ourselves. That's all what we mean when we say cultural engagement. Also, I think when people use the phrase specifically in a Christian context, often what they mean is we're going to not reflexively assume that all culture is bad, which is a perspective that pops up in some Christian traditions in particular. And I don't know if this still happens, but at least when I was in college, cultural engagement tended to mean like having a Bible study where you talk about the Matrix. So that's great, but I think there's a lot more to it than that, and I think the problem might reside with the word engagement. So I look up the word engagement and get some different definitions. One is occupy, attract, or involve someone's interest or attention. And another is participate or become involved in. And so here's the thing, everyone is always engaging culture. There's no like task there, right? There's in fact nobody who's not engaging culture. I like to tell my students that even if you choose to ignore culture, you are engaging it, right? You are saying this is a thing that I have deemed unworthy of my notice, and so there's a mode there in which you're engaging culture. You could also engage culture, and our friend Andy Crouch writes about this in his book Culture Making. You can engage it by consuming it without any thought. You can engage it by critiquing it all the time, condemning it, or just copying it. And so the reason cultural engagement is inescapable is that culture is inescapable. So Andy defines culture simply, and I like his definition, as what humans make of the world. And usually when we talk about culture, we actually mean arts and entertainment. But there is the sense in which we can't get rid of it. Like, it's not going to go away. And even if you never personally watch the latest blockbuster film, when we have those again, other people are going to be talking about it, and your decision to participate or not participate in those conversations is engagement. And then engaging culture is a description of nothing. So in order to go beyond engaging the culture, there are some things that I think are good for us as Christians to think about, especially as we live in a world that's saturated and soaked in screens and in entertainment and streaming services where we can watch literally anything that's ever come out, all the time. And everything's kind of being collapsed into one big blob that we can engage in. So I think what we need to think about as Christians is the manner in which we engage culture and what our aims are. So now I'm going to speak from my perspective as someone whose job it is to observe, analyze, write about, contextualize culture, which is as a critic. Um, so as a Christian critic, I often get emails from students all over the place, and of course my own students as well. And often they will say to me, "You're a Christian, you're a critic, I'm working in a mainstream outlet. I used to before I was at Vox, I worked at Christianity Today, so I've kind of done both sides of the business there." And people will say, "Okay, so what is your actual job, as a Christian doing this job in this place?" And my answer kind of changes a little bit depending on who I'm talking to and what I think they're actually asking me. But the theme that I've come up with for my answer is always kind of the same, which is that I think that the Christian critic's job, and this would go for anyone engaging with culture, is healing broken spots in culture. I think of it that way. And also being able to look clearly at it and love it for what it is before we try to start fixing it. So I have been reading a lot of Hannah Arendt's work lately, and one of her ideas that's really captured me and kind of motivated me is amor mundi, which is love of the world. And she actually pulls a lot of this from her work on First John and on St. Augustine, which is interesting to me. But her idea that we have to actually look at the world clearly with clear eyes and accept it for what it is before we can start to actually love it and change it. And so I think that's something that we have to do as well as Christians. We have to actually be able to look at the cultural landscape and say, these are the broken spots. We understand that they're there. We try to understand why they're there, and then we try to understand what would heal them. So I've kind of identified a bunch that I bump into all the time. You probably have others that you've noticed, but these are not the ones I typically hear Christians talking about when they talk about culture. Normally I hear them saying things like, "Oh, they have ideas that I don't agree with, or these stories have characters whose life choices I find, reprehensible or just objectionable, or I feel like they're attacking me." Those are ways that I've heard Christians talk about culture, but I think there's some other things we could talk about. So first, I've noticed that in culture, particularly today, and I would say even more than 15 years ago when I started writing about culture, is that there's a real consumer mindset in the world, just among people, about what culture is. And this consumer mindset makes us think and feel and act as if art and culture are things that we are to buy and consume, and that's what we're doing, right? So this kind of goes along with that word content, which I'll get to in a moment. But the idea that when I am presented with a work of art or a book or a movie, that what I am being presented with is something that I can choose to purchase and use for myself. That's different than thinking of it as a gift, for instance, which is a totally different metaphor and one that artists have thought about for a long time, or a bridge between my experience and yours, which is something that many people have written about, including C.S. Lewis, or an opportunity to sort of see the world through someone else's eyes. That's frequently not in the conversation. And I think that leads to a second thing that I've noticed, which is, I'm going to call them toxic fandoms and allegiances, but really it's this inclination to see the culture I love as being representative of who I am and what who I am in alliance with, and then trying to kind of pit things against each other. So as a film critic, I see this in the way that people talk about, like, this is going to be a silly answer, but Marvel versus DC or something like that. But you can see this really popping up, and also kind of turning cultural objects into almost political objects when there's no politics involved. They're just things that if you like this, then it means you belong to this group, and that's bad. And if you like this, you're not allowed to say anything bad about it. This certainly crops up a lot on the internet, but I've seen a lot of it, and there's just more and more all the time. Another thing that I've noticed is the elevation of the content of the thing over the form and the context. So one thing that I often talk to my students about is that a movie is not just what it is about, but how it is about it. And when I worked in Christian media, I found this to be a problem with people who, would object to watching a movie because it had profanity in it without maybe taking into account the context of the profanity. There's a difference between a word being uttered in context of maybe just a conversation between two people and in a war context, or nudity, right? Like there's different ways that nudity can pop up in a film. That doesn't mean that it's for everyone, but we have to think about those content things within the context and within the form. And that tendency has really spread outside of Christian media. It's been kind of interesting to watch it happen, where we can't talk about something without people assuming we're glorifying that thing. So that's a problem that I see that's hurting art. Another thing is the idea of all kind of art as being content. Like I think of this as like candy that gets thrown down a tube at us, right? And so I will hear people talk about how they want to become content creators, and I kind of cringe, because content is just like a filler for your time, and that's different from wanting to become a craftsman of a work of art. And this also affects the way that people get paid, and the way that people can make a living at making art. It also suggests that bigger and flashier things are better. Another big one for me that I've seen is incuriosity. So there's no judgment for what you might have been watching over the last year, because it's been rough. We all need some comfort food. But I think that there is a tendency, particularly in American culture, to want to only consume comfort food, or only consume things that make us feel like seen, which is good, can be good, but also doesn't expand our horizons at all. So there's no like curiosity to like try something that I've never tried before, or say, oh, I don't like fantasy, so I'm not going to watch that thing that I've heard is really good, because it's just not for me, right? Curiosity, on the other hand, is a way that we start to interact with others in a different way. And then that brings us to the final one, which is fear of the other. I find this mostly in Christian circles, but it certainly has broadened out, which is when I encounter something that makes me feel uncomfortable in a work of art, and reflexively think that the problem is with the person who made it, or the person it reflects or represents, rather than possibly with me. And it may be true that I'm uncomfortable for a reason that is legitimate, but there's a reflexive idea that if I'm uncomfortable, then the thing is bad. Instead of maybe I need to be made uncomfortable here. Okay, so if those are broken spots, I just want to quickly point out what critics do, because I know this is always a thing that people don't think about too much, and then come back and see how we together can heal those broken spots. So first of all, I firmly believe that everyone is a critic. Not everyone is a professional critic who, spends a lot of time and energy and intellectual power on this, but everyone does engage in the act of criticism. So what is criticism? So critics who actually write and or make videos or whatever, they are doing they're creating what I think of as ekphrasis. So ekphrasis is technically it's poetry about visual art, and there's a long history there dating back to the ancient Greeks, but more broadly, it's just art about art. And so a critic is really hopefully crafting a new piece of art, whether it's an actual review or an essay, or maybe it's some other work that helps us to understand another work of art better. So hopefully a critic writes an essay or a review, and you can read it and appreciate it for its own artistry, in addition to whatever it's evaluating or it's just expanding. That means that critics are creators as well. And when we critique something, or we just simply explore it, we are creating a new thing in and of itself. But another thing we're doing is cultivating. So cultivating, and this is going back to Andy Crouch's work again, because it's just so concise and simple to understand. Cultivation is sort of like what you do in your garden, right? You go out to your garden, and there's weeds in it, or maybe you're not even growing anything in it yet, but you know, like something needs to be done before you can plant the tomatoes. So you till the soil and you pull up some weeds, and you maybe put like fertilizer in, and then you add the tomato plants, and then you have to keep going out there and pulling out the weeds, or else the tomatoes will get choked out and they'll die. So cultivation is doing things that help to create space for creation. And I think critics especially do this work. And I think that that's the work that everyone can do. So when we all go see a movie or watch a TV show or read a book, and then we talk to one another about it, one of our goals should be to help help us think through what's successful about this. What does it show us about the world? What can it inspire us to do? And then also to say, where does it fall short and how could it be better? And then the final thing that critics do is make pathways for audiences. I think this is probably the biggest part of my work, which is that I want you, having read something that I've written, because that's the medium I work in, to be able to then go to the thing I was writing about and have your own experience with the work. And maybe you don't agree with me at the end of the day. Like maybe I hated this movie and you watch it and you're like, oh, I think there's something really amazing in here. That's fine. I don't really care if you agree with my opinion or not, but hopefully, having read what I've written, you have an expanded view of the thing itself. Or maybe you watch the movie and then you read the review, which is something a lot of people do. And they're looking for someone to kind of help them unpack the experience they've just had. That's what critics do as well. But that's something we can do with one another, whether or not we actually are writing criticism, because we all have different experiences of a work of art. And when we come together and talk about it, we can help bring my point of view to the work, and someone else can bring theirs to the work, and we can start to really have a conversation. And that's what art does, is connect us to one another. Okay, so having thought through all of those things, I was thinking about what is it that we can do to help remedy some of these broken spots, and I came up with a few things. One is, I think we're able to, if we're coming to the work of criticism with a sort of a generous spirit, then what we're doing is hopefully changing that consumer mindset, where it's, this artist made this thing for me to buy it and consume it for myself. Instead, we can think about a host and a guest mindset. So I've just been reading this really good little book called Be My Guest, I believe it's called, by Priya Basil. And she talks a lot in that about food and feasting and immigration and all of these different things. But one thing she keeps pointing out is that our lives are filtered through the question of who is the host and who is the guest in this situation. And when we talk about art, the artist is the host. Even if we don't know that person, we don't really know who they are. We don't know what their purpose was in making this, but we do know that they've created something for us and they've put it on a table. And we've come in and said, okay, like I'm the guest here. How am I going to treat this artist with respect? And it could be at the end of the day, you're like, this host made a bad meal. That's fine, right? But we're still coming at it with the expectation that we are guests at a table. And I think that changes very much the way that we interact with works of art. Instead of having toxic allegiances around works of art, we might instead find community. So I think, a lot of my community comes from talking to people who like arguing about films. That's most of my friends. And, we can find community around what we love. We can also find community around maybe we don't love the same things, but we have the same purpose. And those might be within our religious communities, they might be outside of them, but that's something that art provides for us, and that's a reorientation. Another thing is to balance content, form, and context. So when we see something and we're offended by it for some reason, we can start to think about, okay, first of all, what I'm taking away from this what the movie actually wants me to take away from it? Is this thing in this book actually what the book says, right? Does the book glorify this behavior, or is the book thinking about this behavior as something that we should not be engaging in? So it was a big conversation around when the TV show Mad Men was on. Great show. Lots and lots of people talked about it as if it glorified sort of reprehensible behavior. And I think there's a little bit of a mismatch between content and context, or content and form there. So the only way to do this is for us to be very thoughtful when we're watching a movie, for instance, to think about what's on screen, what's the rhythm and pacing of the storytelling, what images am I looking at, in addition to what's the story being told, or how many swears did a person have. And this goes for every art form. Moving away from the idea of content creation to the idea of artistic creation and valuing the artistic project. This is a really tricky one, because if you want to be creating art, the world into which you're going is thinking of you as a machine to pump out art that they can sell. Not that there's anything wrong with obviously having your art sold, but how can we create new systems, or how can we rethink the systems that exist so that they will value things like craft, like taking your time, like emotional health for the artist, like challenging and risky perspectives. That's something that Hollywood has not been good at. It's something that the book publishing industry hasn't been very good at. And it would be so encouraging and wonderful for people to not let the fast-paced world that we live in take over art creation, and instead think this way. Moving away from a spirit of curiosity, I just, I don't want to deal with that, or like, I'm too tired, and it becomes a way of life, into a spirit of discovery. So, for me, this is very simple, but one thing I'll do sometimes is just like make a list of the 10 movies I need to watch about this topic, or made by this director, or from this part of the world, or this era, and then watch through them, set myself a schedule and watch through them. If I leave it to chance all the time, I'm probably never going to do that. But consciously engaging in things that I know nothing about makes a huge difference for how we then start to encounter the world off screen or off the page. And changing and shifting fear of the other into love of neighbor, which I don't even think I need to explain too much. Christians have a wonderful context for this. We already believe that this is what we ought to be doing, but we can put it into practice, and we can bring that belief into our experience more broadly, and our communities more broadly, and saying, this movie is made by somebody from halfway around the world. I don't really understand it, but I'm going to engage with it nonetheless. So hopefully what happens at that point is that we kind of move away from the idea of engagement, and instead we move towards creation, and towards new paradigms of creation, towards cultivation, and finding ways to make space for creativity to happen. A hospitality mindset where we are willing to be guests at someone's table, or if we're the creators, we are the hosts of a banquet. And discovery, just the excitement of discovery. There's no lower stakes way to encounter another culture or another person's way of thinking than engaging with their art. And it's also the most delightful way. So I think more of it would be wonderful, and certainly more of it than we currently see. So I've hit about time, and I'm going to unshare this screen so that I pop back up. But this is a great time to take some questions. So I am here for them.
First one is, for those of us not necessarily engaged in writing or art in our studies, i.e. for the STEM crowd, do you have any advice for how we can tune into our creative sides despite not necessarily having to use or build creativity as much?
Yeah, I was saying in my Bazaar session earlier that I did my undergraduate in information technology and computer science at RPI in upstate New York. And so I'm like very well aware of this. I do think one thing that is great for scientifically and technically minded people is to dig into all the stuff, sort of all the applications of creativity that are happening in your own field. There's nobody more well suited for that than, for instance, I was a coder, and I felt like I learned a lot about writing once I started writing from what I learned while I was coding, just about like creating elegant and hospitable code to future people who might encounter it. And I know that's different, it's wildly different for every fields, but I think that's an interesting way to kind of think about it, that creativity is, and even creation is not limited to like these siloed art disciplines. And of course, there are a lot of artistic disciplines at this point that are leaning on those same things. I always thought like bio art is very interesting, where people are working with living materials in order to create beautiful things. But I think thinking broadly about art and artistic creation, right? Art is just something that that we're humans are digging their fingers into and creating in such a way that an audience could come and have their own experience with it. And I think that's broadly applicable to everyone. Outside of making things, I do think that everyone is benefited when folks who are in STEM fields are culturally literate. And so I would just encourage you to ask your friends who are deep in the culture, like, what's the one thing I should make sure I'm paying attention to right now? And then like actually doing it. It's good for your soul, but it's also good for your work, because it gives you, it's a new way of thinking. And I know within STEM, we can get so one track on our kind of rails that have been set before us, that it's really helpful to engage with artists. Even ask them if you can collaborate with them in some way.
Nice. I have a couple that are here that are related to writing for a non-Christian audience. So I'm just going to read both of them, and
Okay.
then you can take it from there. So one person asks, when you write an article from a Christian worldview, do you have a certain process? Do you write differently when writing or not writing from a Christian perspective? Or is the goal to always be writing from a Christian perspective? And another that is kind of related is Christians often use their own lingo, Christianese, when speaking of cultural artifacts. What are some of your best practices for kind of editing that out or dialing that back a bit?
Yeah, great question. Let's see. So I'm always writing from a Christian perspective because I'm a Christian. So I don't really have like another choice. We're all writing from whatever our perspective is. And my context is very specific too, because I'm not just a Christian. I'm also a woman. I'm a millennial. I have like all these things that are part of me. So those are my perspective that I come to the page with. But I think the question has a little more to do with when I'm more explicitly Christian on the page. And then other times, right? So there are lots of, because I write about films, I'm usually thinking about them. There are lots of films that don't require me to come in and like use theology to write about them. That's not true for all of them. I have written many reviews where I explicitly identify as a Christian in the review in order to say, this is the perspective I'm coming from. And this especially matters when I'm writing about like a movie like First Reformed or Silence, which is a movie where I'm like, this is my people that we're talking about here. And so I have this perspective. But I'm lucky in writing for a mainstream publication that, my editor, I believe she'd say she's a lapsed Catholic. She's not particularly religious. And she has no idea what I'm talking about if I use lingo. And I try not to, but I try to write something that she'll understand, and then she helps me kind of edit out the stuff that doesn't make sense to her or explain it further. But I did start doing this when I was writing for Christianity Today. And my big reasoning was that I figured out at some point that actually a sizable portion of the readership of the movies section there were people who had sort of copped to the fact that we weren't writing too many swears kinds of reviews, but we were actually trying to engage with the movies on their own terms. And that meant that I started trying to eliminate as much as I could any language like we know as Christians, or anything that would make sense in the church walls, but would not make much sense outside the church walls, because I knew that they were listening. And that wasn't in an attempt to like evangelize or something. It was just to make sure it was understandable. And then the last thing I'll say is that I came to believe at Christianity Today, and I believe this to be true, that if there's not like two categories of art where one is like bad for Christians and then this one is like bad for everybody. I think those are the same thing. Like if it's bad for Christians, it's bad for everybody. And so what I'm looking for is, does this denigrate the dignity of God's image, right? Does this denigrate human dignity? Then it's bad. It doesn't matter if it's a Christian or not. Does this movie make fun of Christians? That doesn't mean it's bad for Christians to watch, right? So there's like thinking about Christians as just humans that's the perspective that I'm working from as a critic. And so I'm not coming in with like my Christian glasses. I'm just coming in with like my regular, you know, glasses, and saying, here's how I see it. And then if necessary, I'm bringing up my kind of bona fides if I happen to be talking about something that has to do with Christian identity, which is a little bit different.
Awesome. Several more student questions coming in now. Let's see. You had mentioned that criticism is also about creation. How do you approach reviewing and writing essays as a form of creation and art?
Yeah, so I went and got a Master of Fine Arts in nonfiction writing, which is not a prerequisite, but it was very helpful for me, because it's sort of funny to think about getting a studio art degree in nonfiction, which you wouldn't think of as art, but actually the craft of nonfiction is as difficult as the craft of fiction or poetry and draws on those genres. Um, so I think for me, a lot of this has to do with making sure that I've created a hospitable piece of work, right? That I'm not trying to write a review that proves to you that I'm smarter than you. That's Nobody wants to read that. I don't want to read that. Like the only person who benefits from that is the person who wrote it. I also don't want to write something. Yeah, I don't want to write something that makes you feel stupid. I don't want to write something that makes you feel like you're bad for not having noticed something, if I can help it. So that's all part of making good art, right? Like art that makes people feel like they're invited to this experience, even if the experience is uncomfortable, they're invited. That's important. And then just basic craft things. Like I work really hard on my sentences to make sure that they work together rhythmically. I think a lot about my leads and my kickers, because I want to make sure that your experience reading this is pleasurable and meaningful, and that you come away with something. And I work a lot on my argument. Like I want to make sure if I'm arguing for something that it's supported, and that is an art, that is not a technical thing, that's an art to kind of rhetorically argue for a point and let you see the world through my eyes in some way, which is all the same kind of thing that artists do. So I think those are really important. And I think virtually any writing class is helpful in this way if it's any good, because even if you're writing, and my MFA was basically writing memoir, which is a genre I hate writing, but writing it helped me become a much better critic. And I sometimes draw on memoir techniques when I'm writing criticism.
Awesome. So a couple questions related to bringing people sort of into your perspective. So again, I'll just read both of them. So the first is, how do you love culture while simultaneously trying to illuminate the aspects of its brokenness in several areas? And then the other is, how do you cultivate the ability to praise a work of art instead of just drawing attention to its failings?
Yeah, great question. So let me think here. So as far as praising the work of art, that's the fun part. Like I actually, I shouldn't say this. I know critics who delight in pointing out everything that's wrong with a work of art, but I think that for the most part, critics are just, there's this perception that critics are people who hate art, and that's why they become critics. They just want to talk about how bad it is. Those are bad critics. Those are not critics you should be reading. Critics who are good at their jobs are people who went into this fairly low paying and low appreciation position in order to be able to engage more fully with the art form that they love. They're not failed usually at what it is that they're writing about. They love this thing. And so I think the perspective that I've always come from is that when I'm writing a negative review, which I don't have to do too often, but when I'm writing a negative review, I try to come at it from a position of lament. That's how I think about it in my head. I would never write that in an article. That sounds way too pretentious, but I am thinking like, this could have been good, right? I can see the ways it could have been good. I expect that the filmmaker did not set out to make a bad movie. Like nobody spends years of their lives purposely to make something terrible unless they're making a ton of money, and that's like a whole separate issue, right? But like generally filmmakers want to make good movies. So instead of being like, this person is the worst person on earth, instead I try to keep my focus on the work, where it fails, and what could have been better, which is hopefully just like, I'm not doing this so that the filmmaker can read it and be like, next time I know how to make it better, because I don't know what a filmmaker does. But what I am doing is trying to get the reader to see, like, for themselves where the rough spots are and how they could have been made more straight, I guess. So I think that's maybe the better perspective. It doesn't mean I don't write pans. I do. I usually get in like 1 or 2 really good pans a year, but usually it's, it's someone who like should have known better because they've been making movies for 25 years and they clearly just punted on this one. Or, it's there's those genre of movie that I think of as like giant ATM in the sky movies, where it's like, it doesn't matter if this movie's any good, you will still watch it and pay for it. If they're bad, I do not mind telling you how bad they are, but most of the time I'm trying to think of it as an act of smoothing the way. And I've kind of forgotten what the gist of the first question was. Sorry. Oh, you're muted.
I am sorry about that.
Yeah.
The gist of the first was how to love culture while illuminating aspects with brokenness.
Yeah. And so the answer is, first of all, you can't do this if you don't love it. But I think the answer to that is like, if you love a person, or if you want to love a person, you spend a lot of time with them. You like pay attention to what they're saying. You make sure that you're kind of there, and you're not checking out. And I think that learning to love culture does have a lot to do with the same things, showing up, reading books. This isn't just in the abstract, like you actually go watch a movie, and then trying to figure out, again, I think community is important here together. What's good about this? What's bad about this? How could it have been better? And not succumbing to the reflex that there is now, which is like, I see this one problem with this, and therefore it's all bad and we should throw it out. Art is much more complicated than that, and that should be freeing for us.
Okay, so I think that's an interesting lead in to one other question that we have from the students, because you've just said that we need to show up in order to love culture. But one student is asking basically whether we can show up too much, if we can overconsume art, and how we can kind of approach binge culture, how we might be able to approach just how much art there is out there. When people, want to take it all in, but there's not a lot of time, and there are kind of some negative ramifications there.
Yeah, there totally are. And I mean, believe me, I know. I just the Sundance Film Festival was virtual this year, but I just watched 39 movies in a week at the festival, which is not normal for me. I would not normally watch that many, but I was reminded of like how exhausting it is to do that. One thing I would say is, if I can do it, you can do it, because it's literally my job to watch like 5 to 6 movies a week. And I try to watch other things too, and I try to read, and I try to take it all in. This is one of those places where it's good to set up guide posts for yourself, where you're like, these are the times I'm not going to be doing this thing, right? Or I would like strongly advise not binge watching things if you can help it. You can help it. What am I saying? Of course you can help it. Everyone before you has done it, so you can do it too. And saying like, I'm actually just going to watch 1 or 2 episodes of this, and then I'm gonna like turn it off and go do something else. Something that's been useful for me during the last year, when I'm not going out a lot and I don't have a lot of things going on in the evenings like I usually do, is to make lists that have like, I'm just going to read a chapter a day of this book. I'm not going to sit down and read the whole thing. And I've gotten through more stuff somehow that way, but I've also remembered it. And I think another thing that's good is to take up the practice of note taking, or processing your thoughts, whatever that looks like. So for some people, it's like they actually write about every chapter in a thing, or they review films on Letterboxd or whatever, but it's just a way of slowing down and processing for yourself what just happened, even if it's just a paragraph. I think that can be really valuable, and it does keep you from just inhaling things with no without tasting them, basically, which you would never do with a good meal. And I think treating art that way is a good idea. That's not to say that, like, if you had a bad week and you just need to sit and like binge watch whatever your show of choice is, that's fine. But if that's your entire diet, it's going to be really bad in the end for your ability to like understand or discern or even just like fully appreciate the riches that you have available.
Okay, two more rapid fire.
All
So
right.
the first is, for those of us interested in trying our hand at essays on arts and culture, what do you recommend? That's related to a lot of what we discussed in the bazaar earlier, but and then the second is just, what's your favorite movie?
I'll go backwards. My favorite, the answer I usually give to that one is a movie called Blue from 1994. It's three colors blue. It's one in a trilogy, but it's the first in a trilogy by the Polish filmmaker Krzysztof Kieslowski. It's a French film. In brief, he was approached by some French movie executives who wanted him to make a series of films, blue, white, and red, one for each color of the French flag, that would explore the ideal embodied in that culture. So fraternity, equality, and liberty. Yes, well, the other way. So Blue is liberty. And it's a film in which Juliette Binoche plays a woman who kind of is given the ability to have ultimate freedom in her life. And Kieslowski did a very interesting thing in how he tells this story and sort of suggests that maybe like liberty is good, but too much liberty is actually not good for us and not the way we're supposed to live. So I believe it's on HBO Max right now. So that's usually my answer. As far as writing essays and reviews and all those kinds of things, I mean, the only way to do it is to start doing it. There's not a lot of ways around that. You should be reading it. Like, you should read the New York Times Magazine every weekend, because that's great stuff. You should be reading, journals that have criticism in them, just to get a feel for all the different things that people can do. Buy a Zadie Smith book of essays and read it cover to cover and see what she's doing. But then to write it. And I was saying earlier today that like I kind of started out in 2005 when like blogging was a thing people were still doing, but you don't need a blog. You can write a newsletter. You can just put it on Letterboxd. You could make a blog if you want to, or put it on Medium, or you can, you have the ability to write for student publications or group blogs. There's all kinds of options, but I think you just kind of have to sit down and do it. And the best way to learn to write is to imitate a writer you like. Figure out how they do what they do, reverse engineer it, and then just pretend you're them. And I took that note, I believe, from Joan Didion. So if Joan Didion did that and it turned her into the writer she is, then I think the rest of us can learn from that advice too.